I'm going to show you how to work with configurations via the Orchestrator REST API. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Brian Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place.
In the previous videos, I've been showing you how to use the Orchestrator REST API to work with Orchestrator objects such as workflows and actions. In this video, we're going to turn our attention to something else called configurations. Let's take a look at that in the lab environment. If you already know what configurations are in Orchestrator, you can take a look at the timeline and jump ahead to the next section. For those of you who don't know what configurations are, let me give you a quick demonstration. In Orchestrator, you can see configurations by going to Assets Configurations. And as you can see here in my Orchestrator server, there are two configurations that have already been configured by VMware. But rather than work with those, let's create our own new configuration. We'll do so by clicking New Configuration. We'll give our configuration a name. Let's get rid of that default name and change it to something else such as VVork Info. I'm going to use this configuration to store all sorts of different information about VVork. So we change the configuration name. Notice, if you would, the ID of this configuration is 050 F as in Foxtrot. We could type in a description such as info about VVork. We could enter a description number and so forth. But ultimately, what you're going to be doing with these configurations is going to the Variables tab and creating new variables. The point of these variables is to define them here in this central location and then be able to use these variables in any of our workflows. If we ever need to change the value of a variable, we'll be able to change it just once right here, and all of the workflows that are using that configuration element will be automatically updated. So let's create a handful of configuration variables. To create the first one, we'll click on New. We'll give our configuration variable name, such as maybe we want to know what city VVork is located in. You can type a description. I'm going to skip that. You could choose different types of variables. I'm going to go with a nice simple string, and I'm going to set the value here to Santa Cruz because VVork is located in Santa Cruz, California. We click Create, and we've defined our first configuration variable. If we want to, we can keep doing that. Let's create a new variable. So new. Why don't we say that the state that VVork is in is good old California? And just to show that you can create variables of different types, I'm going to click New. This time, it's not going to be a string. It's going to be a secure string. And the name of this variable is going to be super secret password. And the value is this super long password here. Again, what we've done here is we've created a configuration called VVork Info. That configuration contains three configuration variables called city, state, and super secret password. Now, if we save this and go over to workflows, now if we create a new workflow, I'll give it a name. We'll create it. And now what we're going to do as we develop this workflow is when we create variables, instead of creating a variable and hard coding its value into this one workflow, what we can do instead is create a new variable in our workflow, give it a name. Again, we can give it a description, we can give it a type. In this case, the thing I'm going to be working with is a secure string. And here's the kicker. Here's where configurations come into play. Instead of hard coding the password here, I already have that password stored in a configuration. So we're going to bind this variable in our workflow to our configuration element variable. So we have a configuration called VVork Info. And within that configuration, there's a configuration variable called super secret password. And in addition, there are other variables in the configuration, but since they don't match the type secure string, they're not showing up here. I'm only seeing things that are secure strings. If I simply select that configuration variable and click create, you'll notice that the way we display the value looks a little different. Normally you'd see the hard-coded value. This icon's telling us that this variable in our workflow is linked to a configuration variable in the configuration called VVork info, and specifically the configuration variable called super secret password. Now again, this variable, as I use it, can work like other variables that I've been working with. The key thing that's different here is its value is defined elsewhere. The value of this variable is defined in the configuration repository. And if you'd like to, you can continue experimenting with this, but that's the basic idea behind configurations. Now what we're going to do is turn our attention to how to work with configurations using REST requests. Now, as you can see, I've already defined some REST requests here, and we're going to, in this video, take a look at the first two. So get all configurations and get one configuration. Now, as a quick reminder, we have API documentation to tell us how to create these REST requests. So let's pop back over to our lovely web browser. And as you know, if we go to Orchestrator server/vco/api/docs, that'll show us all the different REST requests that we can make. The ones that we're interested in are the ones here in the category called configuration-controller. And what we're going to be working with first is this REST request. If we do a get/configurations, that's going to get us a list of all the configurations, which you'll recall right now should give us, let's find it here. Right now, we currently have 3 configurations. So let's go take a look at what happens when we use the endpoint URL that we just looked up in the documentation to look up all the configurations. So we'll click send. And as you can see, our response body comes back in JSON format. We got a status code 200, which is great. And again, rather than scroll through this here, why don't we copy this and paste this response body over in Notepad++. I'm using JSON tools, so I'll type Control-Alt-Shift-P to pretty this up and Control-Alt-Shift-J to get the tree view. And over in the tree view, we can see that our response body came back in JSON format. It contains an array that has 3 items in it. That number rings a bell. Remember, we have 3 different configuration elements, so this is an array of our 3 different configurations. So let's go to Notepad. This is an array of, link is an array of our 3 configurations. If we expand that array, again, there are 3 items there. And if I'm not mistaken, item number 2 here is going to be our configuration that we just set up. Now, as you can see, I'm expanding this here so that we can see everything that's going on in this one configuration. So for this one configuration, we can see that it has an attribute to let us know the ID of the configuration that we're looking at. So out of these 3, this is the one that has the ID that ends in 050 Foxtrot. You'll recall that ID we saw earlier. The next attribute has the name of the configuration. So this is the configuration we created called VVork info. Again, over here in Orchestrator, that's telling us we're looking at this configuration. And as we continue onwards here, we can see the description of the configuration. Again, that's the description of the configuration. And additionally, we can see its version number, along with we have a link here that we can use to look up more information about this specific configuration, which is coincidentally what we're just about to do with the next REST request. So let's pop on over back into Postman. And again, the next request that we're going to look at is this one called get one configuration. Now, you'll notice that the endpoint URL is a little bit different because this time we don't want information about all the configurations. We just don't want information about one of the configurations. And specifically, that's going to be the configuration called VVork info. All right. Now, as we can see here in the endpoint URL that I've already defined for you, if we want to do this REST operation, we have to pass in the ID of the configuration that we're interested in. Now, one way we could get the configuration ID would be to go to Orchestrator's UI. So go into Orchestrator Client and open up the configuration. And right here, or also up in the URL, here is the configuration ID. we could copy that ID and go over to Postman, and instead of using a variable, we could paste in that ID, but we want this to be more flexible, so we're going to use variables instead. So let's undo that, and let's go investigate configuration ID. That is a Postman variable, which you can see right here. Now, you'll notice that something has automatically set the value of this Postman variable called configuration ID to the ID 9880808 blah, 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 blah. This is actually the ID of the first configuration. Again, back in Orchestrator, the first configuration over here, called batch action, has that as its ID. So perhaps you're asking yourself right now, how did this Postman variable get set up automatically? It's exactly what we need to do a get one configuration REST request, but how did this get set? Well, the answer to that is in the first REST request, the test code is going in and it's simply setting configuration ID to the ID of the first configuration record that was returned. Now, we're not so interested in that one. We're interested in the third one. Way down here on the bottom, we've got this third configuration. Let me scroll up a bit, called VVork info. That's the ID of the VVork info configuration element. So what we could do here is go back to VVork, our Postman variables, go to configuration ID and change this to instead have the configuration ID of the configuration that we just created, the one called VVork info. Now, if we do that, we'll go ahead and click save. Alternatively, another way that you can do that in Postman is if you have a value such as this here, select it. If you right click and choose set VVork configuration underscore ID, that will do the same thing. So a little trick there for you in Postman. So now if we go to our second REST request, this REST request is going to look up just a single configuration, and the configuration it's going to look up is the one that we just created. Notice the configuration ID here ends in 050 Foxtrot. That's the ID of the configuration we just created. So let's go ahead and send this request and see what we get. Well, I see we get a 200 code. That's good. And we get a response body in JSON format. Again, to make this a little easier to explore, I'm going to copy this and take it over to Notepad++, open up a new tab, Control V to paste, Control Alt P to pretty it up, Control Alt J to update the tree viewer. And looking in the tree viewer here, what we're seeing here in the tree viewer and also over on the left is information about just one configuration. And you'll notice if you take a look at the name, this is information about the configuration called VVork info. Once again, we can see the ID ends in 050 Foxtrot, and we can see the description and so forth. But crucially, what we have here is an array called attributes. If we open up attributes, and actually before I open up attributes, in this context, in this specific response body, attributes in this context means variables. In other contexts in other response bodies, that word attributes means something a little different. So for right now, just think of this as being the array of the variables in that configuration. If we expand this array, you'll notice that we have 3 items. That's not because we have 3 different configurations. Rather, that's because we have 3 variables in the VVork info configuration. So don't confuse those two. So looking at our response body, these 3 array entries correspond to the configuration variables. So if we randomly pick one of these, why don't we look at element 2 and expand it fully, you'll notice that element 2 is describing or giving us information about the configuration variable called super secret password. You'll recall that was the one that was the secure string. These other 2 are the string variables called city and state. So as you can see, using just these two simple REST requests, get all configurations and get one configuration, you can quickly look up information about all the configurations and all the configuration variables, or you can zero in on just the specific information that you need. As you can see, there are a couple other REST requests here that will enable you to create a new configuration and or configuration variables, and additionally a REST request that allows you to update configuration variables. Now, to understand how all those work, you can watch the upcoming video, but also remember always that we have documentation that explains how to create and use these REST requests. So again, those last two REST requests that I just showed you are detailed here in the put method and the post method. Join me in the next video as we continue to explore the Orchestrator REST API.